Hello again, everyone. This is continuing sort of a little unintentional mini-series I've ended up doing within my series of fairy videos, which are kind of looking at the way fairies intersect and are portrayed in pop culture. So on one of the last videos I did where I was talking about basically urban fantasy books that I recommend that I find are pretty good and true to the source material, and I think I talked about some movies as well. A comment had come up on the video specifically asking about descriptions and appearances of the good folk in pop culture contrasted to actual folklore. So that's a super good question, and it's also a really interesting topic to kind of take a look at. Because descriptions, physical descriptions of the good folk in pop culture, surprisingly, for the most part, actually end up being truer to folklore than you might expect. Now, I do want to say we're kind of talking about two different categories of pop culture here. So we have the written pop culture, popular culture, which would be largely urban fantasy and then high fantasy works. And then we would also have depictions in movies and television shows. Now, when it comes to the movies and television shows, they don't do as well, although some of them certainly do better than others. For example, as I believe I mentioned in the last video, I haven't actually seen the TV series The Magicians, but I've been made aware through friends and social media that the second season has a storyline that involves the otherworld and the fair folk and kind of specifically gets into fairy queens and depicting the good folk and that sort of thing. And from what I have seen based on brief clips of the show and also still photos of the show, the way that they are depicted physically is actually pretty good in that. In contrast, of course, the vast majority of what we see in movies and TV shows is not good. And actually sort of contributes to the problematic understanding of fairies, which is sort of drawing on to get the imagery, but then is perpetuating. And that is coming pretty much from the Victorian era and Edwardian era and sort of early 20th century artwork, especially, that we see. So we'll start sort of with the problematic depictions of them to establish a baseline here. And these would be what we see both in artwork and in the movies and TV shows that depict the good folk as all being extremely small and tiny, sometimes insect-sized tiny, and often winged, sort of Disney's Tinkerbell would be like the baseline for this description, sort of the stereotype. If you kind of stick with that image of them being somewhere between like 6 and 10 inches tall, with wings, we can kind of vary that a little bit. Sometimes they'll be up to maybe 2 or 3 feet tall, sometimes with wings, sometimes not. But there's a lot of emphasis on the very small fairies, and particularly that sort of Victorian era stereotype of them as spirits very entwined with nature. You'll see them depicted a lot wearing green, very, very often wearing green, being mostly benign, granting wishes, things like that. That seems to be sort of what we often see in movies and TV shows. Not exclusively, of course. There are some better depictions out there. I mentioned some in the last video. I mentioned The Magicians here. Like I said, I haven't actually seen that, so I don't know how the characterization is, but the physical description in that one doesn't seem to be bad. So there we go. Now, this is one case where fiction in writing Although, again, you will sometimes find written examples that do adhere to the problematic depictions, the tiny winged sprite kind of view of fairies. Those are out there as well, inevitably. But a lot of times what happens is, because urban fantasy and high fantasy really anthropomorphizes fairies, really makes fairies of any variety very human-like. Human-like in their motivation, human-like in their characterization, really makes them sort of magical humans for the most part. What we end up seeing in a lot of the material that's out there in writing is that they're basically physically described as humans. They're generally going to be anywhere, sometimes starting at that 3-foot range, going up to like 5 or 6 feet. They can occasionally fall into what I sort of refer to as the Tolkien trap. You can see I have Tolkien behind me, which is the idea that people have gotten from Tolkien's written works, and also, of course, from the movies, that the fair folk, the elves in particular, but the fairies in general, would be both tall and very slim, very model-esque, very stunningly beautiful. Sometimes. But you do sort of see that as a very sort of common stereotype now in a lot of the urban fantasy and high fantasy. High fantasy much more strongly than the urban fantasy. Urban fantasy tends to use a broader palette when it comes to describing fairies, and they tend to draw more on diverse folklore. High fantasy tends to stick with the idea of very specific types of fairies, particularly elves, and sometimes, a small range within that. Sort of the idea that we would see in the standard Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game character sheet sort of thing. You might have elves, you might have orcs, you might have goblins. You may occasionally have a little bit more variety in there. Usually not a lot, but occasionally some. Dryads, for example, tend to make some odd appearances. But usually it's a fairly narrow typing that you'll see in high fantasy. In urban fantasy, there's a lot more diversity and a lot more pulling on different types of folklore. So the physical descriptions tend to range a lot more. And as I said at the start of this, that is actually much more in line with what we see in the actual folklore. Although there can still be problems in these descriptions because it is fiction. And authors like to be creative, like to add their own little details, and in a lot of cases they'll add things specifically to make it clear that the character isn't human, even though they're acting pretty much like a human. So they might, for example, have a character that has like a green tint to their skin, or naturally green or purple hair, and that is not something you see in folklore pretty much ever. At all. At least not in the folklore that I've studied, which is specifically the Celtic language-speaking folklore. You do see, though, and this is the nice advantage with the urban fantasy, you do see the variety in the types of beings. So you'll see Kelpies, you'll see Barghest, you'll see a variety of different depictions of elves. You'll even see the Aes the Inishe. Irish is a very popular folklore for people to look to. That is problematic in its own sense a lot of times. I have some personal opinions about people taking the Irish folklore and then mangling it terribly. I'll actually link in the comments to this video to a really good blog talking about why Irish folklore is not just a sort of shortcut to equals fantasy. But it is possible to draw on folklore and do it well, which we discussed in the last video. There's a really good book series called believe it's Fairy Sworn by Ron C. Nato. I might be mispronouncing the last name. Neito. Where the main character is a Kelpie. Draws heavily on Scottish folklore, and you encounter different creatures throughout her books, including several of the gentry, a fairy queen, a Knucklevee, a hag. I'm trying to think of what else. Just an assortment of different folklore creatures, but they're treated fairly well for that particular series. They stick pretty close to what you would expect in folklore. So that tends to be one that I do recommend to people. So when we're looking at physical descriptions in folklore, you really have a huge range. You have fairy animals that would look like the cat-she, which you find in Ireland and Scotland. Looks like a black cat with a white spot on its chest, but it's much larger than a cat would be. They usually are described as like dog-sized. You have the cooshie, fairy dogs, again, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. Cuanún would be the Welsh, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they can be black or white, or sometimes even very dark green. And again, they look somewhat like mortal dogs, but they're usually larger, described as like calf size, so they'd be sort of enormous in human dog terms. You see fairy horses, you see fairies that can take the shape of a horse but are not actually a horse. Those are sort of two different groupings. And those would be things like the Kelpie, the Echuski, Puka. I knew there was a third one. Puka are shapeshifters. They can take multiple different forms. They can look like a goat or a pony, or an eagle, or a small sort of unattractive looking man, which is an important point to bring up, by the way, that fairies in folklore are not always super attractive, beautiful looking sort of beings. A lot of times in folklore, they can look young, or they can look old, they can look beautiful, they can look sort of plain or ordinary, they can look unattractive to us. In fiction, both high fantasy and urban fantasy, we tend to see this motif being put forward of, if it's good, if it's good aligned, if it's positive, if it's helpful, it is going to be beautiful. If it is bad, if it is going to hurt you, if it is negative, if it's one of the antagonists in the book, then it is going to be physically ugly, for the most part. Sometimes, like, the main antagonist in the story might break these rules, but a lot of the time, this is sort of the overarching pattern that we see. That is decidedly not true in folklore. In folklore, things that look particularly beautiful or enticing are often very dangerous. Babanshee, Lonanshee, Kelpies, Ihuski, a lot of the fae folk that are known for preying on humans and eating humans, using humans as a food source, are quite physically attractive in whatever form they're taking. That's part of the lore, if you will. Lore, L-U-R-E, like to lure you in, not lore as in folklore. Well, both, actually. And things that are unattractive, that we might consider to be ugly or repulsive even, may not be dangerous to us. They may. Goblins are not known for their beauty by human standards, but things like the Gilledouv are known to be, sort of unattractive to humans, but can be helpful, and are usually kindly inclined to humanity. Brownies, again, not known for meeting human beauty standard, but known to be helpful for the most part. The Puka, which I already mentioned, when they're in a human form, sort of described as like a wizened old man, but they can be mischievous and can cause harm. They can also be helpful. So in the realm of folklore, in the realm of fairies in the real world, if you will, you really can't judge their intentions or their, so-called goodness or badness based on how humans would judge their attractiveness. Because it just doesn't work that way. Kind of the same way like among humans, you can't look at a human and say, well, they're pretty, so they must be nice. Or, I find them unattractive, so they must be mean. It just does not work that way. Unfortunately, it does tend to work that way a lot in fiction. Not exclusively, but often. In movies to a degree, and also in writing. So that is certainly a difference between fiction and actual folklore. When we look at the actual folklore as well, sometimes there's very little in appearance to differentiate a being between a human and something that's of the other world. Really what makes them different is they tend to have this sort of aura to them of otherworldliness. They have magical abilities, they have powers that humans don't have, and it's just their personality, their character. They are clearly not a human. They don't think like humans, they are not motivated by the things that humans are motivated by for the most part. They often don't act like humans. There's a pretty well-known thing with fairy wives, laughing at funerals, crying at births, things like that. So it's just sort of this idea that they tend to act a little inexplicably, and they have their own rules of etiquette, they have their own rules of behavior. They're just not human beings. So that tends to differentiate them a lot more than physical appearance. The idea, for example, of elves having pointed ears is extremely modern. And again, like many things with fairies, originally started in visual artwork. And it was just a way for the artist to differentiate between, in a painting, what might be a human character in the painting to something that was supposed to be an elf. Particularly with the elves, because fairies ended up with wings thanks to the theater. So we see this idea of elves being depicted in paintings and artwork with pointed ears. And there's multiple reasons about that. I actually have written a whole long blog piece about why we see elves with pointed ears, which I'm not going to rehash here. But the point is it comes from artwork, and after it had been in artwork for a certain amount of time, it started to find its way into modern literature, contemporary literature at that time. And I think particularly once Tolkien took it up, and he actually had a big debate with himself about that. If you read some of his more obscure writing and his personal notes, he was kind of unclear on whether he was going to have his elves and his hobbits have pointed ears or not. Went a little back and forth with that, and he obviously ended up eventually going with the pointed ear thing. What could have been if he hadn't. But either way, when we look at anecdotal accounts and folklore, we do not find pointed ears. That is just not a thing. As ubiquitous as it is now in high fantasy and urban fantasy, you really rarely, if ever, will find accounts in any sort of modern fiction, English language modern fiction at least, that is not going to depict the fair folk, fairies, elves of any type without pointed ears. Occasionally, but very, very rarely. It's just sort of taken as a given now. So that is certainly one significant difference between, fictional depictions of fairies and folkloric depictions. Outside of that, when we look at fictional depictions, movies, TV, writing, particularly now, you do find a lot more diversity, and that is in line with the folklore. We do have folkloric accounts that describe fairies with a variety of hair colors, Their eye color's not too often discussed, but particularly a variety of hair colors, a variety of skin colors. I know I did mention earlier, I was kind of ragging on the idea of green skin in fiction, but the only unnatural skin color I can think of offhand is gray. There are some hints in some of the Orcadian material that the Trows might have had gray or grayish skin. It's a little uncertain. They're referred to as the gray neighbors there, but they're also said to dress in gray, so it could just come from that. But generally speaking, any skin color that you would see potentially in a human, any hair color that you would see potentially in a human. There was a period of time where in fictional depictions you would pretty much see sort of this standard fairies, fairfolk elves were often to always going to be depicted as Caucasian, green or blue eyes, and usually fair-haired. And that is definitely not true to folklore. It was just, I think, an aesthetic thing. I'll probably blame the Victorians for that on principle. Luckily, that did shift and go back to more of what we see kind of distinctly in the folklore. And clearly, if you're getting into folklore of areas outside of the Celtic language speaking areas, if you're looking at folklore of fairy-like beings around the world, they're going to reflect the human population that would live in those same areas. We can't do a whole debate about why that might be, but they will. So the idea of fairies having sort of diverse appearances, that is definitely true to folklore. There's a book, I think it's on the upper shelf up there somewhere on my bookshelf. It's called, I want to say, The Good Fairies of New York. And that one, although it does adhere to the fairies are tiny and have wings trope, does a really good job at showing the cultural diversity of fairies. It's a story of these two Scottish fairies who kind of get in trouble and have to flee Scotland and end up in New York City, and sort of entwine themselves with the lives of these two humans who sort of don't want them there. Well, one of them doesn't anyway. And have these adventures in the city while they're there. And part of that involves encountering fairies from other cultures. And that was a particularly interesting choice by the author to show the diversity. I mean, there's some issue with it because he depicts all of the fairies as these tiny little winged sort of sprites, which we definitely would not find around the world in different cultural iterations, if you will. But the concept behind it of showing fairies in different cultures, Chinese fairies, African fairies, that was pretty solid and pretty interesting to see in modern fiction. So that was cool. And my point with all that, of course, is just that when we're talking about actual physical descriptions of fairies in folklore, you do have that diversity, anecdotal accounts as well. And that is something that we find in the folklore as well. So that would be fairly accurate. Beyond that, physical descriptions, you see female presenting fairies, male presenting fairies, androgynous fairies. You see a variety of heights in folklore. Again, fiction has followed this to different degrees at different points. There have been points where, female fairies were more strongly emphasized. There was certainly a point that I remember in the late 80s or early 90s where androgynous fairies were like the thing. Everyone was into androgynous fairies for a while. Also sort of, agender, asexual fairies. That was a trend briefly. Now it seems like male fairies are sort of trendy, but that might also be because fairies are pretty big in paranormal romance. Everything cycles. It's been vampires, it's been werewolves. Sort of fairies are having their moment, or we're on the tail end of them having their moment at least. So that could be part of it. from my point of view anyway. So, we do sort of see that whole range. And that would also be generally true to folklore. Androgynous fairies are a little less common, although we do see them. Usually encounters with fairies and anecdotal accounts in folklore, at least the person relating the story or the person having the experience, does tend to strongly gender the being that they're seeing, one way or another. Even if the being that they're gendering is doing something or acting in a way that's against sort of the gender norms for the time. So, for example, we see male fairies that are described as very strongly male presenting, but engaging in what would be considered a feminine human role at the time, in the kitchen, for example. Male brownies doing housework and cleaning. That is sort of going against what would be considered the common gender norm at the time. So there is some interesting layers to that go on. When it comes to modern fiction, you do see that whole range of presentation in appearance and all that. So that would also be in line with folklore. And I think that covers pretty much everything. Physical description beyond that, I mentioned them being seen as slim. They aren't always in folklore. You have a whole range of body types. So there's that as well. But I think I've covered the topic pretty thoroughly. If you have any questions or any other topics you'd like to see me do, just toss it in the comments. Have a nice day.